Arthur, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I have some comments on your comments if you'd like.
Yeah, just jump right in. We don't even have to ask you a question.
Well, living in the jungle, it's like 98 degrees all the time, and it's mud and full of snakes and scorpions and stuff and mosquitoes. But living in a tent in the jungle, once you get used to that, you kind of need some scotch in the evening. But I mean, you can't binge drink it because you got to make it last.
Yeah, I was just gonna say you have to bring it in yourself, right? There's probably not an easy way.
No, it's boat and 4-wheel drive vehicle, and you can't get there except by riverboat. Ultimately,
oh wow.
So. And I do have the best philosophy library in the entire Petén rainforest. I'm reasonably sure of that. I haven't actually checked, but
I already like this episode. I just want to say
I love it there. I really love it there.
Let's talk about civilization collapsing. Happier topics. What makes a civilization collapse?
Almost all civilizations collapse, especially complex ones. And there are many different reasons, but after studying, I teach about 18 or 19 collapses, and I'm working now with Angkor collapse. I've also been working with business people, like Bart Victor at the Owen School of Business about it, and you see patterns, but the broadest pattern is that often, maybe usually, the strengths of a civilization, its basic characteristics, over time are the same things that bring it down. And the other thing you see is a broad characterization. People think collapse, decline, things fall apart little by little. The apogees of civilizations, the great fluorescences, are often the collapses. The collapse is going on, and it looks really good from the monuments and stuff, and then there are a bunch of patterns that you see over and over again, many of which apply to us and business and so on. So I can't really help you with being optimistic. I'm sort of, I'm sort of like, a funeral parlor director of civilizations. I emphasize the collapses because from the way they collapse, you can go back and see what went wrong and how they were structured. So it's also just a way to look more carefully at the basic features of civilizations, too.
I'm curious. So you said that often civilizations collapse due to the same characteristics that may have defined their strong periods. So the strengths become their weaknesses. Give us a concrete example of this civilization where you can point to one aspect of the civilization that made it thrive, and then that same aspect proved to be its undoing.
Well, it's never one aspect, but a perfect example is the Maya civilization, and I've been working comparatively with Angkor in Cambodia. They have Angkor Wat, and it's very similar in both of them, and that is that high civilizations really aren't supposed to exist in tropical forest because of the thin soils, the fragile environment, and all of that. And they really, the lost cities in the jungle thing is, it's kind of like what I do, and that's one of the reasons why there's so much public interest, because you always have those in the movies. But there really aren't a lot of places. And so their successful secret was to adapt their cities to the tropical forest and to make them kind of more green and spread out, and to mimic the diversity and diversion of all different kinds of field systems. Nothing like Kansas, no monoculture of one crop, but a lot of different kinds of field systems sensitive to the microenvironment. And that means it had to be decentralized so the local farmers could do things, and that was great. And many things can go wrong, though, as you start to get too successful and build up, and population grows. That begins to put a strain on the environment. But the latest stuff that I've been doing, and this is the work that I'm doing now at Con Quen, this Maya city, and the whole region. My projects cover a whole region. It's actually a big part of that's owned by Vanderbilt. But anyway, they started to switch. The whole world of Mesoamerica began to switch to something much closer to our kind of economy. Long-distance exchange, over the basic characteristics of our economy since Mesopotamia, Western economies, is overproduction of one thing in one area, and then overproduction of another thing in another area, and exchange through a market. Like, you have tons of wheat in one
Right.
area and goats in another, and then you have a market exchange, sometimes over large distances. That had started to spread because, that's sort of, it's closer to capitalism in a way. It's very successful, and it kind of spread through Mesoamerica, and once that really took hold, the Maya area was not very competitive, and eventually their trade routes were, taken over by various peoples and moved to the coasts, and also their decentralized system. How do you hold together a civilization that's like that, dispersed? And the answer you see in Angkor Wat and with the Maya is this divine kingship system where these huge rituals and these beautiful ceremonial centers that kind of hold the state together, and the king's power isn't just political, it's largely religious. They're divine kings, and that's perfect for the forest. But also, the king is, he's a general, he's a ruler, he's also like the Pope. He's also a ball player in their games. He's also a performer. They sang and danced. And anything that goes wrong is his fault. Because, even if it's just like, bad rains or crops or a hurricane, whatever it is, he's supposed to be talking to the gods and the ancestor, But anyway, that's an example of a civilization whose basic, wonderful adaptation to the rainforest made them vulnerable. Angkor has the same exact type of collapse. I mean, ours will be very, very different from that. More like the Indus, I think.
So I'm just curious, when these societies start nearing collapse, do you see certain patterns of behavior by their elites, like their kings and their religious figures? Because, of course, with the rise of Donald Trump and some other populist or nationalist parties in Europe, we've really seen a lot of judgment heaped on the elites of those particular political systems.
Well, yeah, you do see counter movements and counter trends, which are sometimes good and sometimes not. But those are usually reactions to an ongoing, as you said, an ongoing collapse. What you see most, and this is one of the things that you can talk about to CEOs and all, and is that the leaders do more of what they do. They intensify whatever they do, because that's they don't know about doing something else, so they just intensify.
So they double and triple down on the existing order.
Yeah, and it is almost always counterproductive. It's almost always counterproductive. With the Maya and Angkor, things are not going well, so obviously you got to build more temples. They have to be more impressive, bigger rituals, make the gods happy, but also make the people happy. And so you're taking more and more energy out of the environment and bringing things down, and you see that over and over again. And it's I think it's going on pretty obviously right now. I would say more in business and technology than in politics. I think in our case the politics is sort of a reaction to the trend, not leading it. And that is often the case.
We got to take a quick break, and we're back with Professor Arthur Demarest. He's a anthropologist who studies the collapse of civilizations. He's been called the real-life Indiana Jones. We were talking about, before the break, how when civilizations collapse, you see leaders doubling and tripling down on whatever they're doing now. You mentioned that you see that a lot in business, not just in civilizations, but you see it in business. What are some examples when you talk to business schools and business leaders? What are some examples that sort of really highlight this behavior?
That behavior often also comes from short-term thinking and leaders trying to hold on to power by doing more of what they do. And you really see that with CEOs now, I think. The short cycle in which they're judged, and this is also happening with politicians, it's shorter and shorter cycles on which they're judged, leads them to try to make fast reactions, fast solutions. And you really can't a business, a CEO is like a president, can't go out and say, well, we're going to slow down and have really much slower growth and probably, lower stock prices for 3 or 4 years, and we can build back up, and then, all these politicians, the new president, and actually all of them will say, well, we're going to fix all this, and they were only in there for 4 or 8 years. You can't fix anything with that. You can just lay groundwork. So they during that period, they can't, you don't have time to restructure things. So you just intensify. And, that's a pattern that's it's very common, and that's one of the reasons why apogees or fluorescences, the peak of things, actually looks really great to us, especially with ancient civilizations, or even historical ones. But that really is some of that going on, and I think it's also some of that you see in bubbles, the bubbles you see with like the high tech bubble and the e bubble, all of that. The real estate bubble. That is a perfect example of intensifying more and more something that has been successful and is actually beginning to undermine the system, and then it leads right into collapse. And so once you start studying that, you look back at things like the Renaissance in Italy, which the Renaissance was a collapse. It was a complete collapse, and it ended in, disaster, as did the golden age of Greece and so on. So when people are looking for, the down periods, they don't see that factor, and it is really very common, and that's because of that leadership problems. You run into problems, it just leads you to think in sort of desperate solutions, shorter and shorter solutions. It's happening, I think, also with high tech a lot. The hypercoherence is just being made worse constantly.
Joe and I have spent probably many hours at this point talking about market bubbles and what tips bubbles, from euphoria into fear and pain, I suppose. Is there a particular thing, like one thing that you could pinpoint that's the tipping point when it comes to civilizations?
Not one. The thing that I'm making these statements, and they apply. And the thing that's great about the study of civilizations, and I'm teaching this class right now that is a seminar that's 18 civilizations. They have different lessons, and so you draw different aspects from different cultures, and then you can see that those patterns reapplying. So not all of the collapses are that kind of apogee bubble thing. You do see the pattern of that intensification of what you do. You do see the pattern almost always of shorter and shorter term thinking. You're getting into trouble, so you're trying to fix it faster and faster, and that is another counterproductive response. You can also see you also study non-collapse. I mean, most of the time there's a near collapse, and then they change some things, and they have maybe a kind of a big recession, and then they go on. So you also get to study, why there was a collapse in this case and not in another case. Our civilization, I would take from the Indus hypercoherence.
What does that mean, hypercoherence? Explain that term.
Well, it's one of those really great strengths. I mean, I think one of you is in Abu Dhabi. It's the integration of the society. The society gets better and better integrated, leading to better decision making, leading to great wealth. And a good example is our situation. We're probably the most hypercoherent, where the computer, right, the internet, the satellites, we're all tied together, and that's great. And it's getting more and more over time, and that's creating more and more wealth. And with the e-network and Amazon and all the rest. But if there's a problem in one part of the system, it radiates through the whole system, and at a certain point can bring the whole thing down, which we see, like there's a slowdown, not even a recession in China, and pizza parlors are closing all over, Chile. You can see it I see it. I tell people that the four most common words in the English language are "the system is down." You hear that everywhere. And there's some glitch in something in Atlanta, and Delta has to cancel 3,000 flights. I mean, that happens all the time, that kind of thing. We are really hypercoherent, and it's the source of our great wealth, but it really is becoming a vulnerability. And the response to that, because you have business competition, is more and more integration, better and better systems of integration, and more hypercoherence and more fragility.
I was just going to say, it seems like the natural conclusion from that point would be to build sort of walls into the system, or to build some sort of protection or buffer. But people up until very recently didn't really seem to like doing that. Like, going against the grain of globalization was seen as a bad thing, particularly for markets and economics. These are things that business people in particular don't like to hear.
Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them, and this we've taken from business with my interactions with my colleagues, but there's one popular theory that as societies become more complex, investment has diminishing marginal returns. At first you make an investment of $100 in Microsoft, and then, over time, you don't get, 1,000% profit. It slows down gradually, and eventually, as you add more employees and so on, it breaks off, or even causes the system to slow down and to become less productive, and you go from diminishing marginal returns to diminishing returns, and that happens a lot in complex societies. The other problem is status rivalry, which you see with men. That's one of the problems in the Renaissance. You see it with us. It's companies and countries, and so when you know that you really should sort of slow down, and it costs money to do the backup systems, and it may just require cutting down on the degree of hypercoherence. That causes profit loss. That causes that diminishing marginal returns, and the rulers of the Maya states or the rulers of the Renaissance cities, they can't get away with that. They've got a public that wants things more quickly, and again, that when you have that kind of competition, the desire to beat the other guy or do better is really that's what the leader depends upon.
Does that competition sort of engender what you say, these apogees of civilization, the building of pyramids, the funding of great works of art? Is that part of what drives that? So you have everyone competing for status and trying to establish something great to compensate for the decline, and so we get these periods that look amazing, but they're actually a phenomenon of decline?
That's perfect. I think better phrased than mine. I'm not accustomed to saying things in less than an hour and a half, but that's why it's called status rivalry. War is a form of status rivalry, but also, like the Renaissance is a good example, competitive art and building cathedrals better than the other guy and so on. And it does generate this magnificence. And Bill Gates had just said this is the best time in history or art history, in terms of the way the world is or something. And I said, wow, that's really ominous, because that's when you start to say something like that, maybe you're in a crescendo, maybe you're in a bubble, and you see that over and over again. It looks really, really great, like the Maya civilization. Wow, Angkor, incredible stuff they're building in the jungle, but everyone admires. The Renaissance, look at all of that, it looks great, but that's more and more expenditure. And it's also leaders competing with other leaders. It's more with CEOs now, but also with countries. And that keeps it accelerating, keeps it looking better and better, and keeps making it more and more fragile.
So when Donald Trump says he wants to build a Great Wall and start an infrastructure fund and ramp up defense spending and things like that, how worried should we be?
Well, we should. Again, I think these things are more of... people are worried about Trump, and that's a symptom more than a cause. It's the pressure for shorter and shorter term results. which happens as things begin to not keep up and people begin to get dissatisfied, like all of the workers in Pennsylvania and so on. You then, you see counter movements and reactions. But the problem with what he wants to do and what every president has wanted to do to some degree, the promises of renewing our infrastructure and building the wall, the problem is that that can't be done quickly. And, that really ties into a whole other group of theories that some people call entanglement theory, which is that you build this infrastructure that is so great and so wonderful, but then over time, the government, the institutions, the people are sort of entangled in it. And as you lose resources, you're dependent on this system that you can't maintain. And it's impossible to really scale back. You can't say, well, we can't maintain this interstate system, so we're just going to concentrate on some main roads, or this subway line is really losing money, so we're just going to close it. Mayors can't do that. They'll get kicked out. So what you get is this. This happened with Angor and a lot of them, this dependence on this infrastructure and no way to really, when it gets to be hard to fund and maintain, no way to do that. So you have, you intensify efforts and you just don't have the resources, and it can bring the whole civilization down. Real quickly,
because we're just about out of time, just a few seconds, how quickly can it all collapse?
Very quickly. I'm sorry. This has been very depressing. With more time, I could make your listeners weep. Would you like that? No, it can happen very, very quickly. The Maya civilization was most spectacular at around 780, 790, 785. And by 810, it was just in pieces, 800 in a lot of places. So it can happen really, really quickly. It's often happens slowly in one part, and then that reaches a critical point, and then it just runs through the whole system, which is what happened also with the Maya. Yes.
I have one more quick question before you go. When civilization collapses, can Joe and I come stay in your tent and drink scotch and read philosophy books?
That's the key question.
Hey, man. You know what? I am ready. I am ready than any survivalist. We have no electricity, no running water, but we have a river right there. We have a tent. The Maya grow the food all around there, the turkeys and the corn. And I don't think we're even going to know when the collapse comes out there, except it'll be hard to get the good scotch, and that really may shut us down.
Well, Tracy and I will definitely bring some. Professor Demarest, thank you so much. Fascinating, depressing, but still very enlightening. Lots to chew on. Now I'm going to go read all your books. Really appreciate you joining us.
Okay, thanks.
So, Joe, are we all sufficiently depressed, or are you going to be reaching for the scotch tonight?
No, you know what? I think I'm in a better mood than I was. At the beginning, I was feeling pretty glum, and then obviously that was pretty down. But now I'm just sort of excited about studying a new thing, and I'm not joking. Now I'm going to go download all his books to my Kindle, and it's the circle of it's good to know that patterns repeat. It's sort of comforting.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Like the idea that even if Western civilization collapses, that's kind of a normal thing across the millennia. It's unfortunate for us, though, if we live through that collapse. But yes, it's somewhat comforting.
I'd never thought of things like the pyramids or the Renaissance. I thought that was a fascinating idea that these things that we associate with the peak are actually signs of the decline. It sort of makes me think of all of history in a way a little bit differently.
All right.